the Overman Warrior Podcast.
Hi, Rich Hoffman here. I have to say that this is probably one of the most important books ever produced by a human being or beings. This is by Windover, the archaeologist who was the lead project manager of the Windover archaeological dig. It was from 1984 to 87, I think. It was a 3-year period, the mid-80s, when it was discovered that a housing development was going in near Titusville, just up the road from Kennedy Space Center. And as they were digging, a backhoe operator dug up some bones. It was a giant cemetery from what they were calling the Windover people, very mysterious group of people who had a cemetery, a very logical cemetery buried in the bogs. They had to have known that they were preserving these bodies, and the dates on them turned out to be 8,000 years old. So it does not fit the classic model of the migration of what they call indigenous people from Asia into Beringia down into North America. This site introduces a lot of new information that is extremely important to catch, and it was captured in this book. A very extensive, this is a very academic publication put out by Florida State University. So it's there's probably only a few thousand copies of this in the world. Probably didn't even sell close to that, probably around 1,000. I'm happy to have my hands on one of them. Because it essentially all the work that was done over a 3-year dig period in the Windover site in this cemetery that uncovered these 8,000-year-old people that still had, because the bog was so wonderfully preserved the bodies. There was still brain tissue in the skulls, and they still had skin, and I could still tell what they had eaten. The last meals they had was still in their stomach. So you learned a lot about people who were 8,000 years old, essentially, and a much more advanced culture than anybody thought possible at the time. And that's why it's important to continue digging and having research and exploring these areas when people tell you there's no evidence that any of this kind of stuff happened, because right now you're dealing with a restricted science that has artificial constraints put upon it, and the human necessity to know has drawn lots of conclusions. Like, for instance, with these guys, there's a lot of talk about how big the bones were. And in this entire book, all the chronicles of them, looks like the largest person they found was around 6'1"-ish. Although the example, the thigh of an example that was presented at the museum showed a figure that could have easily been over 7 feet tall. This kind of explains the early reports of large people, giants in North America that were uncovered before institutionalized science came along and whisked it away. And I think that even though this book has no conspiracies in it whatsoever. Gwen Dorn, this is probably the most important archaeological site in the world. Windover was for a small 3-year period, and all you see there now is it recovered, and a plaque is there to kind of tell you what was there. And there's half the place, half of the cemetery was left completely untouched. So all the bones are still there as they were. And this is largely a decision because they saw the tide coming from NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that was approved by Congress on November 16th of 1990, just a little bit after the Dances with Wolves movie came out. So at the time, everybody was crazy about preserving Native American history as it was framed by that movie. And what you realize when you really look at science, that even what you call a Native American, and this is where I'm at, you don't want to take anything away from anybody, but it's how you set history and the timeline and what you do to kind of accommodate the acquisition of knowledge. Does the acquisition of knowledge trump reverence for the legacy of indigenous people, as it's claimed? Well, when you find people who are 8,000 years old and you're measuring the DNA sampling of indigenous people being 300 or 400 years, and you're attributing them to tribes like the Iroquois, the Lakota, the Sioux, you can't take that sampling that was only taken a very shallow depth of historical knowledge and apply it to history, because now you dig up bones like this, and who do you repatriate them to? Who do you give them to? Because when they did the dig and they did the examination, the importance of this site is that it came out, it was thoroughly dug, reported in this book by people who genuinely cared and loved, and it was really the last window of archaeology before this Repatriation Act stopped digs essentially in North America, because anytime you dug up a skeleton of what you called an indigenous person, you had to repatriate it back to the people you stole the land from, which NAGPRA is loaded with political language meant to solidify a invalidation of the claims that America should exist. So there's all kinds of progressivism into it. It's migrated into these schools, the colleges. You don't get any grant money unless you go along with this narrative. So it essentially takes the Dances with Wolves argument, applies it to law, and now every time you dig something, dig up a bone, you have to repatriate it, report it, and it shuts down your dig site. So it completely motivates developers to just go on. Don't report the sites. You dig up some bones, don't tell anybody about it, because it's going to shut down your site. They're going to take over your land. You're not going to be able to use it for what you bought it for, and then you're going to be caught in a whole lot of trouble with some indigenous tribe that we've called through politics the original inhabitants of America, so that people who want to topple the United States can have a valid argument of repatriation and claiming of that land to the indigenous people that should have never lost it, based on the argument of Western expansion. So that's really what it came down to. It's not a reverence to the dead of the cultures that you're uncovering, as much as it's about invalidating the Western expansion that came out of Europe and settled to make the nation of America. So now you've got archaeology all wrapped up in this, and when I look at the kind of archaeology that's done in England, when you can see it on television, and it's a very good show. Some of the time team stuff that they do. Francis Pryor and the gang, they have open digs. They uncover all kinds of things. They find bones all the time, and they don't have to repatriate them in destructive ways that keep you from not having any discovering of the culture. So when you talk about all these giants, and there's all this institutionalized science that's upset that so many people are speculating about giants in North America, and there are newspaper reports, and they want to call them frauds and fakes. The human need to know is outweighing the ability to institutionalize control of the narrative. And clearly what happened at Windover was a narrative was uncovered that was very disconcerting to the official Beringia argument. And the more everybody learned about it, the quicker they couldn't pass this law to keep any more digs like that from happening. So Gwen Doran, and the reason this is such a unique book is because before NAGPRA was approved and passed, and then everything after that pretty much stopped digs in North America. So you couldn't go back and say, oh, why were these people 8,000 years old? They had textiles, they had clothing that would have required a loom to be so delicate. And it's well preserved because of the burial method they used. It just so happened that the developers of this housing complex were extremely curious about what they were digging up, and they turned it over to Glenn Doran and the gang to have a proper archaeological expedition into the site. And they put their plans on hold, actually helped fund the dig, which is really unique. And were an active part of this happening. So the conditions which made that book possible are highly rare in any field of archaeology. And I tend to love archaeologists, and I love books like this, and I love reading about books. Love reading about archaeological sites and the good work that gets done through academia, or has been. But when you start bringing political elements into it, which clearly was going on with the NAGPRA law of 1990. I would argue that this Windover site proves the assumptions that brought NAGPRA into law, and that probably should be repealed, not to be disrespectful to any what you call Native Americans. I think you have to, if you're going to have a Native American designation, you have to go back and look at the Windover people as being candidates for that designation, because you're going back before the people of the Indus Valley, before Mesopotamia, any known historic site from 3000 to 4000 BC. This stuff in Windover is older, and it's not a bunch of hunter-gatherers running around. It was a very sophisticated society that doesn't fit the puzzle pieces the way that academia has put together. And it's not a shot at academia. It's just you get evidence and you make conclusions based on what the evidence is telling you. And if you thought that what you saw in what you call Native American cultures, what was preserved, because the rate of erosion and decay only goes back so far, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, and everything pretty much decays into nothing. These bog sites were able, through a pH level that was extremely neutral, preserve even brain tissue from then. So now you have genetic samples, and the genetic samples of these people do show that a majority of their DNA came from Asia, Beringia, but they don't connect to any previously known Native American samples. So that creates a problem for the assumptions of NAGPRA. That the premise of the law needs a reevaluation, and the way that we interpret what we're supposed to do with ancient bones when you find them needs to be reconsidered. But the assumption and the foundation of the NAGPRA law was to invalidate America as a founding country, that we stole the land from the Native Americans as defined by a very shallow scope of history. And we associated the wrong people with that depth of history. The Windover people, and now subsequent cultures all over Florida, off the coast, when the sea levels were much, much lower because of the Ice Age. You have elements of advanced cultures that extend way out beyond the beaches of present-day Florida, miles offshore, mounds and evidence of where these villages were. And this Windover site turns out to be well inland of that culture at that time. So you have a sophisticated culture, don't know much about them. They had an advanced religion. They faced their dead to the north and turned their heads to the west. So you have a thoughtful consideration of a mass burial in a cemetery where they definitely cared for their people. They're weak, they're sick. They had advanced methods of assembling clothing. And not to say that these are large people. I mean, they're large people, even with take away the conspiracies, and these people are large people for archaic periods, the size of people today, essentially. 6 foot, 5'5", 6 foot, 6'1". Likely there's some isolated incidents of some bones, as reported by the museum itself, where the bones are even larger than that. So you can see how some of these stories from early newspaper reports would draw conclusions of who are these large people. They don't look like Little Hopewell Indians or the Adena people, who might have been 5 foot, 5'1", as we knew them. These are much larger people, and they don't match the record as we've observed it. So all this sums up to why that's such a remarkable book, because right before NAGPRA was identified, you had good archaeology done by Glenn Doran and the Florida State University people committed to the field of archaeology, and they did some wonderful work that uncovered a real window into the prehistory of North America, the deep past. And that attaches to this whole global trade network, because in order to get some of the stuff they had, there's things that have been found in those digs that would have had to have occurred over vast trading networks. Not a regional group of hunters and gatherers, but a sophisticated group that was extensive in its reach at a time before we associate history with anything sophisticated at all. We typically think of the migration of civilization as we know it coming out of the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia or Egypt. But as we're learning, those cultures emerged from other previous cultures that were highly advanced, and things just keep getting older and older. All over the Near East, where we have present-day Israel, there's evidence of shaman cultures that go back well into the Ice Age, 13,000 BC, and older, 10,000 BC. The trend is, as you dig and find out what's been concealed, you are discovering that there's a vast, deep history that easily predates Mesopotamian and Indus Valley culture and ancient Egyptians. And this starts leading to these discussions of Atlantis. What was Atlantis as Plato talked about it? Who were all these cultures and people from this very deep past period well into the archaic culture? And you have in this book a very thorough analysis of people from 8,000 years ago, and shows a high level of sophistication. Many thousands of years before the Mesopotamian Valley. So what does that tell us? What gods did they worship? Well, that's the important thing to know. We have a snapshot of true archaeology recorded in this wonderful book that is a hint to much more to come. So you can't dismiss all the reports of ancient bones. You can't dismiss the trade between different nations at a date when you thought that Columbus discovered North America and nobody else before him. And you have to validate that presumption by erasing the past. And you do it by creating laws like NAGPRA and blame it on some political repatriation act where you falsely assume that the Native Americans were the people that you discovered when people from Europe came first. But what you find out is that those groups of people were taking land from even older, more previous people that had much more sophisticated societies. And so we've wrongly designated Native American to a depth of knowledge that is inappropriate for the creation of laws like NAGPRA, and that they need to be completely reconsidered. And that is going to be an issue that I'm going to be dealing with quite a lot, because you can't study history correctly if you are creating artificial constraints by law that are designed to conceal that past. And I will say that because I have enough knowledge of politics to understand how these laws are created. It's not to deface anybody's ancestral rights, but it's understanding whose ancestral rights are we talking about. And when you have a sophisticated society like the Windover people, it only provokes that you should be creating legislation to learn more so that you can find more Windover sites. Now, Glenn Doran and all the people who wrote this great book from the Florida State University group that collected all these original bones from half the cemetery, and they're still under study, still there now, but now it's much harder to talk about the reports because under NAGPRA, they're not really allowed to do much with them because they're the bones of Native Americans, even though the DNA specimens don't align with what was created under the guidelines of NAGPRA, the indigenous tribes that were designated at the time. When you have people who are 8,000 years old or older than that and show a vast trade network, well-preserved bodies, so you can actually see the flesh on their body still, you can get samples from their actual brains. It doesn't get much clearer than that, and all that evidence was put into this fine, fine book. And it makes it the most important archaeological site in the world, and the only thing that's going on at that site to this day, and the only study that's going on at that site, is a plaque saying, hey, we found some things here, and what we found over a 3-year dig period is in this book. Now we buried it because NAGPRA came along and kept us from doing any further digs, and developers stopped telling us what they find because they don't want to get pinned down and have their land confiscated under this Repatriation Act. This political line in the sand that was drawn to essentially pay respect to a group of people who can't make the claims they made. Because the overall political effort was to erase the presence of the creation of America to begin with, and to assume that we stole the land from a group of people. But then, as it turns out, the more you dig, the more you find out they stole the land from a previous group of people. And likely that previous group of people stole the land from another group of people. And everybody stole the land from somebody from each subsequent generation. And the reason why you don't have more information about previous existence, why there's not more evidence, is because we tend to build our cities on top of the ancient cities of ancient cities of ancient cities. And we build on top of the previous cultures. For one, it's like it's each generation claims their own sanctity of that previous generation and wants to do like a dog does, and it's urinate on a tree to claim its territory. We tend to do that to the previous cultures before us. We do that as human beings. We want to overcome our parents, our grandparents, and stake our own claims to our own existence, only to find out when we're grandparents that the youth are doing that to us. And you have this endless cycle. But how can you learn anything along the way? And if you come up with a law like NAGPRA to say, all right, we're going to stop that process and freeze it right here. We're going to say that these people are the native people of the land, and we stole it from them. We owe them everything we've discovered. And gradually we're going to peel back Western civilization and return it to the indigenous people that we've designated in this law. And then you have evidence come out in the 1980s, this wonderful evidence collected in this great book, Windover People, Multidisciplinary Investigation of an Early Archaic Florida Cemetery, and what you learn about the people who were in there. And you have evidence that shows that 1990 law was prematurely constructed, and that we don't know enough about what a Native American is to even call a Native American a Native American. And to even say that all of our assumptions of Western civilization were incorrect because they're rooted in some Christian notion. And that the indigenous people had it right all along, and the gods of nature are what they're supposed to worship. That's when all this stuff becomes not about respecting people's rights, but about politics, purely politics. That's why my new book coming out is called The Politics of Heaven, because ultimately it all comes back to politics and how organized systems take over previous cultures and then redefine the laws to create whatever assumption they politically want to make, want to occur. And often you can point that back to the fights that happen in heaven itself with fallen angels that are always trying to conspire against God. And those same fallen angels erupt themselves in all kinds of pagan rituals that are still at war with the creations of God and mankind is the result of that. And those battles show themselves in the court documents of our current legal civilization and laws like NAGPRA. So the Windover site is excessively important. We need to know a whole lot more about it. Laws like have been passed in the United States trying to undermine any discoveries we do make, and then preventing archaeologists from doing any kind of further validation of what would cascade out of Windover. Where are the other Windovers, to answer Glenn Doran's question? You can hear the frustration of a lot of the archaeologists in this book because they knew NAGPRA was coming. The inside track, that's kind of the undercurrent of the entire book is, hey, we did a lot of great work. We were in a rush to do all we could because we knew the tides of politics were turning against our profession of archaeology. And once NAGPRA was going to be passed, which it was floating around for a while. And when the movie Dance of the Wolves came out, it gave an open window to get the votes to pass it, because who didn't want to go against the nice people that was shown in that movie, the nice Sioux that was had their society destroyed by the encroaching frontier settlers. How devastating all that was for a period of time, and that made it so that they could get NAGPRA passed. But there's a sinister element behind its passage, which was meant to erase or prevent history from actually unfolding. And it was meant to keep books like this from being written, sites like this from being further discovered. And after this site came out, NAGPRA came into law, developers stopped turning in their reports, stopped turning in their fines. But if you found this in a remote little bog site outside Titusville, imagine how much all over the country of North America you see, and even in preserve sites like these freshwater sites in Florida, similar to what was done at Windover. There are likely thousands of these sites everywhere, especially when you consider the sea levels being different at the time. There is vast amounts of evidence of a very well-populated group of people that predate Mesopotamia by thousands of years. And they were in North America. And when you start hearing what was said and reported from descendants from Atlantis that likely migrated and settled civilizations all over the world, Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, Egypt. Egypt reports this transition of people over time. You have a whole lot more evidence pointing towards an ancient Atlantean culture, because how did these people at Windover learn to make complicated clothing? How did they know how to do any of that? Unless they were part of advanced culture. And just because we came up with an assumption and said Native Americans came out of Beringia, they migrated as kind of cavemen, hunters and gatherers who just kind of came across the land bridge and started hunting deer and mammals and had little pockets of civilization. And we want to draw it there and call that a conclusion. And then you find out that none of that's true, that the ancient history goes back much further. You still might have had people migrating from other places, but from where and how did they learn the things they learned? And that's the uncomfortable reality you have to ask in books like this one. That's why it's such a miracle. It's a unique period in history. It's lucky it happened right before the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act came into law in 1990 and froze archaeology in North America essentially from then on. Not so constrained elsewhere in the world, but you see always that there's a layer of politics. You see it in China. China doesn't permit hardly any investigations into their ancient past because they're trying to make sure that everybody looks to the present as reverence for their religious ideology. And an understanding of anything that came before them is something that's not to their benefit, the ruling powers. And that's kind of the case everywhere in the world. So when we talk about, well, there's no evidence for this assumption, well, there's no political legal means to go get the evidence that the assumption then can acquire validation. They've erased the ability to get rid of validation, which has left everybody to have all this speculative reinterpretation of history. Then all you have to validate anything is the written word that came down from stories and mythology and folklore, and then try to understand what they meant. And that was fine until you ran into a site like Windover that actually validates that some of those ancient stories were true. Just like the Dead Sea Scrolls validates the scripture, you know now that cascading word-of-mouth stories passed down from generation to generation that was frozen in time with the Dead Sea Scrolls validates those previous discussions. When you find sites like Windover, it actually supports the legends of history that were verbally communicated with hard archaeological evidence. And to preserve a modern political assumption of land acquisition and the validation of a nation rising on top of a previous culture, like the designated Native American Graves Protection Act was designed to halt and reverse and return the land that was stolen, as they say, back to the people that had it stolen from. Kind of like a big parental parent stealing from what they call a bully, the creation of America, and giving it back to those who were defeated, where the power of government then gets to play the role of parent, giving back the stolen toy to the child. And we turned everything into kind of that game when we should be preserving history and understanding it and having a lot more digs like Windover. That's why this is such a significant book. This is why it's so important. And when archaeologists were actually able to do their job and report it into this big, beautiful hardcover volume put out by Florida State University, it is an archaeological treasure of its own. And it's why the field should not have restrictions like they do on it, because we really do have a need to know. We have a need to know and understand so we don't repeat history and the sinister impact of the legal assumption that you can create a law like NAGPRA and reinterpret history or prevent anybody from discovering that real history through real, true, valid digs that do have hard evidence. Because the goal is to erase the previous assumptions so no one understands that those mistakes are happening right in front of their faces, and they might overthrow the previous culture that is making those laws, which is the real fear they have for their own self-preservation. Because once you start having sites like this one that come out and change the narrative completely, and you're building your complete political power base on an ancient narrative, well, now that you lose the ability to do so because corresponding evidence shows that you're completely off the rocker and you have no claim to any authority at all, which is the truth and overwhelming synopsis of the Windover site. And the theme of my upcoming book, because nobody's written one truly telling that story the way it needs to be told, and my unique experience in politics and business gives me a unique grounding to do so. And I think what I've done so far is really good. This Windover site, I've heard about it, known about it, and I did a lot more research in it because of my own work on this very narrative. And this Windover site is the perfect example of what my point has been all along. And now that this is an obvious conspiracy, the Windover site was the most magnificent archaeological discovery on the face of the earth. And to watch the cover-up occur in my lifetime is all the ammunition I need to take this next step. So if you see that I'm up in the game a little bit on things, this isn't just about defeating school levies or talking about presidential politics, statewide politics, which I will continue to do. But if you've noticed that I've turned it up a notch and put more into it, it's because I'm getting ready to drop a bombshell. The Windover site is just an example that I have of many that shows a political narrative that cascades out of the spiritual realm of heaven itself and a war against God that plays out in our terrestrial existence. And we see the imprint of that in everything that goes on. It certainly is going on with this dig site, even though these guys are scientists, hard science, don't get into speculative thoughts about how big bones are or what the people did and where they came from, whether Plato was right about Atlantis or there was other cultures before that, and perhaps everybody came from Mars and settled, and all of our mythologies come from some previous planet even. What you get is hard evidence, and you want more hard evidence to create bridges to discovery so you don't make the same mistakes over again. But you have a current political system that is run by the descendants of rebels against God, for lack of a better way of understanding it, because you have to kind of take your mythology and folklore and the preserved writings from the past, knowing you have a good track record with sites like Windover or the Dead Sea Scrolls or Flag Fen in Britain. All these sites validate the legends that find themselves in literature, and we need to be digging a lot more to see what more we can learn and validate about those periods, because we either have to make decisions based on that knowledge and not reoccur the same mistakes of the past, or you have a political group that wants to continue the benefits of the perils of the past, which is why they set the historic narrative so shallow as they did in North America with the Native American DNA specimens that were seen before these kinds of digs came about, that showed that those Native American groups had an even older group that would call themselves Native Americans, and probably older even yet, of people who pre-existed them by many thousands of years. And so the NAGPRA law was prematurely made to fit a political example to invalidate the war. My argument would be to invalidate the war that has been in heaven forever, with the descendants of fallen angels possessing the spirits of mankind and controlling society in the background. That evidence is still in blogs like the Windover site and the religious indications that they had, and understanding those will tell you exactly where a lot of our origin stories came from, and erase this current modern political assumption that the modern politics wants that deficiency of knowledge to exist so they can have power over mankind. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to. It wasn't about giving back the bones of ancestors to the Native American tribes. It was about preventing any evidence that their existence as a political order was invalidated, and it created a warrant cause for Western expansion to bring a free civilization and a Christian viewpoint to prove a narrative that has long tried to be concealed by these evil entities that are at war with God himself. And that's what we're dealing with. That's why this is a magnificent book, this Windover. Not that the Windover people were Christians at all. Not that anybody we find and dig their sites anywhere in the world. There's a lot of archaeology still doing Afghanistan, been held down by war. Iran, held down by war. Iraq, hostile conflict. You see that all over the Near East. Hostilities prevent proper excavations, so you can't prove it. And even in Jerusalem, you have 20 feet, 25 feet of soil where you have to dig through to even get down to the Temple of Solomon period. And likely you have to go even further than that in order to get to the true roots. And you can't excavate because you have this constant conflict with elements, religious orders, political shenanigans that keep any proper excavation from happening. And in North America, where there should be the freest place on earth to do these kinds of things, you have laws like NAGPRA that keep that from happening. So what you find, the vast conspiracy, and Glenn Doran, he passed away in 2021. I would have loved to have met him and talked to him about this site, but reading his work here tells me enough about him and a lot of his colleagues and the academics that I know a lot of them. I understand the balance of power between obtaining funding and having to play nice with the people who provide funding and not really having the power themselves over legislature. I do have some of that understanding. I know how bills are written. I know who writes them. I know why they write them. I've seen how this stuff goes, and I know from my experience the intentions behind closed doors that made NAGPRA happen. And all those in academia who don't feel it's in their wheelhouse to talk about such things, because that's the stuff that people outside their pay grade deal with. They just complain about the results, and they're prevented from doing their work because laws have been written to do that. In other places in the world, purposeful hostilities have been brewed along to prevent proper archaeology from occurring. And I say that because I love Biblical Archaeology Review, and I know the challenges of a lot of the people who are out there digging. Their digging seasons are not long enough, and there's too many hostilities to really get a dig permit to do the proper digs as you need them. And then you have the added complications that, ironically, all over the earth, except for in places like this Windover site, where thousands of years went by and no one built a city on top of this site until current times, you find that we build our cities like Jerusalem, like London, like Paris. We built all these cities on top of ancient cultures purposely, time and time again. It's what human beings have done, whether it's Mexico City on top of Tenochtitlan, or you could pick a ton of. Cahokia. I did a whole thing on Cahokia. I was thinking about that. I was kind of finding my words there, because I didn't want to open up a whole another line of dialogue that goes on for another half hour, which I could easily do. But it's amazing to me that the ancient city of Cahokia, that worshipped a Birdman, which is exactly the same kind of character found upriver and Point Pleasant in the Birdman, and all the Native American stories of Indian stories, Native Americans, whatever you want to call them, of Thunderbirds. They all report the same thing. And people have driven by that Cahokia site, a giant ancient city, one of the largest in the world at the time, over 30,000 people, had more people in it than London did at the same time period, which is around 1100, 1200 AD. And fairly recent. That's a recent site. That's not ancient history by any means, but it's old to standards. But people drive by it on the highway every day, and St. Louis is within eyesight. So essentially, St. Louis was built on top of this site, and they really didn't know, as they were building East St. Louis, they didn't know what those big hills were until they dug into them and found, oh, this is an ancient city. No one knows who they are, yet we're going to affiliate all these Native American cultures with them, and none of them were affiliated with it, just like this Windover site. So there's a lot more to know and understand, and this book only hints at that, because even though the book itself is extremely thorough, it's a detailed with DNA-driven evidence and actual preserved clothing done with what could have only been with a loom, a modern-day loom, with technology that should not have existed at the time. It only hints that we are only scratching the surface of history, and still our best information to inform of the deep past is legends and mythology. because we have been able to validate with hard evidence, discovered quite by accident in archaeology, not nearly enough. But what we have found does validate a lot of the folklore and mythology that passed down to us. So when someone like Plato says he learned something from somebody in Egypt, and somebody from Egypt they learned it from somebody who left Atlantis after it was destroyed and sunk, probably outside the Azores and Atlantic Ocean, and all those cultures migrated into Britain and North America and Central America, South America, Egypt, through the Mediterranean, that we have cults all over the Near East that predate the biblical narrative, again by many thousands of years, that show a sophisticated reverence for appeasement of gods, pagan gods, going to a lot of effort in order to appease something. And they weren't crazy. They couldn't all have been crazy. And at this Windover site, even turning the heads of the dead to the setting sun in the west, shows a reverence to appeasement, ritual appeasement, which is a giant cemetery site. I mean, you're talking about people who buried their dead for a purposeful reason that predates the mummification process in Egypt, again by many thousands of years. So it's sophisticated enough to have that knowledge, and there's a lot more to learn. Digs would do it, but you can't dig, and you can't study the bones, you can't study the remains of these cultures anymore, because some pinheaded politicians decided to watch Dances with Wolves and approve a very liberal position to return this sacred ground that they defined away from its stolen properties back to Native Americans, away from the European settlers that came from after Columbus came. And that was NAGPRA, 1990, November 16th. And that law has prevented further inquiry into this very important matter. But the evidence, when people say, where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? The evidence is right here, everybody. Right there. And there's a lot more to go if you could do it. But only in a small accidental window did we uncover this much. And this much tells you a whole lot more, that you need to go back and completely reevaluate deep history and the assumptions of who took what land from who, and what's the validation of current day discovery so you don't repeat the same mistakes. And the people who make laws like NAGPRA, I know and could say from my own political experience, purposely are trying to do so to prevent the inquiry into that knowledge so the current power base can stay intact and have validity to a power structure that only lasts their lifetime, so they can deface the creations of God as God intended it, as a creation on earth as it is in heaven. And there's a lot of elements, especially in politics, at war with that assumption. And I would say, and my premise is, that this Windover site proves that to be true. And I will further expand on it, which is why exactly I'm going into more details about this than anything else that I've covered. And I could easily talk about it for the next 8 or 9 hours without pause. But I think for now, this is enough just to say that this book exists. It's a wonderful book, and I'm grateful that it happened. And I would say that it probably happened under those accidental circumstances so that people would have enough breadcrumbs to find the truth in these discussions and put light where it deserves to be, which is a task that has a lot of merit to it that I'm very attracted to. Anyway, for now, this is Rich Hoffman here. Share, subscribe, make tomorrow a better day. If you ever read my book, The Gunfighter's Guide to Business, I think you'll love it. And as I come together with this Politics of Heaven book and make people more broadly aware of sites like Windover and other sites around the world that have been paved over essentially to conceal them from modern interpretation, I think we're all going to have a lot of fun with that enterprise. And it's going to be exciting and of interest and very educational. Promise. Anyway, have a good day. See you later.
Thank you for listening.